Growing up in a house that looked perfect from the outside was like living in a staged play. The lights were always on, the grass was always mowed, the cars were always washed, but nothing inside felt real. I was the quiet kid, the girl who never raised her hand in class, never brought friends home, and never posted selfies like the other girls at school. People thought I was just shy, maybe even a little strange. But the truth was, silence was the only language I'd ever been fluent in. My name is Hazel, and for the longest time, I thought if I stayed quiet enough, maybe the yelling would stop. My parents were professionals at pretending. My dad, Brian, was the charming dentist in our small suburban town who remembered everyone's names. My mom, Laura, taught piano lessons out of our living room and always wore cardigans and a polite smile. They waved to neighbors, hosted barbecues, went to church on Sundays. But once the door closed and the neighbors weren't looking, everything changed. Their arguments weren't always loud, but they were brutal. Snide comments, slammed doors, long silences that made our home colder than winter. My dad would come home late, reeking of whiskey and cheap cologne, and my mom would just exist, like a ghost with a schedule. There was no affection, no laughter, just routines and resentment. I learned early not to interrupt. I didn't speak at the dinner table unless asked. I cleaned up without being told. I kept my headphones in and my head down. My parents thought I was zoned out on video games or watching makeup tutorials like other girls my age. But I wasn't. I was watching people talk, honestly, emotionally, freely, on YouTube. And then one day, I decided to do the same. Not with my face, not with my name, just my voice. I started a channel called Behind Closed Doors. I recorded audio stories, anonymous ones, narrated in my voice but told in the third person. Each one was based on what I saw and heard in my own house. I changed the names. I blurred the lines. But everything was real. The first story was called The House Where Nobody Hugged. It was 5 minutes long. I recorded it in my closet with a blanket over my head to muffle the background noise. I uploaded it and forgot about it. But 2 days later, it had 17,000 views. I couldn't believe it. The comments poured in. This sounds like my life. I thought I was the only one who grew up like this. Whoever you are, thank you. I sat there, in the dark, staring at the screen as hundreds of strangers poured their hearts into the comments. People were listening, not just to me, but to the pain I thought no one noticed. I made another video, then another, each one more personal than the last. I talked about what it felt like to watch your parents become strangers, what it meant to be invisible in your own home. I shared stories of whispered insults, of dinners eaten in silence, of birthdays forgotten. Within 3 months, the channel had 100,000 subscribers. But my parents still had no idea. To them, I was still just the quiet girl who spent too much time on her laptop. If only they knew I was using that laptop to expose every ugly truth they thought they'd hidden behind closed doors. And then, one day, I made the mistake that changed everything. It was a Friday night. The house was cold and quiet, just like always. My dad was out, probably at the bar he swore he never went to, and my mom was in the kitchen, staring blankly at a crossword puzzle she hadn't touched in weeks. I sat in my room with my back against the wall, recording a story I wasn't sure I should share. But I did it anyway. The video was called The Night He Came Home and Called Her Worthless. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't vague. And for the first time, it wasn't disguised enough. I tried to keep the stories just anonymous enough to protect myself, but that night, I was too angry. Too tired of pretending. Too full of years of swallowed pain. I described my dad stumbling in at 2 a.m., knocking over a lamp, and yelling at my mom about how ungrateful and useless she was. I described her sitting on the floor in the hallway after he slammed the bedroom door, hugging her knees like a child and crying so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I ended the video with a question. Why do people stay in houses that hurt them more than the outside world ever could? I uploaded it at midnight. By morning, it had 200,000 views. By the following night, it hit 1 million. People were obsessed. The comments section exploded. Everyone wanted to know who this family was. Some thought it was fictional. Others swore they recognized the details. Some even started speculating in Reddit threads and online forums, trying to solve the identity of the family behind the channel. I told myself it would blow over. But deep down, I knew I'd gone too far. And the next day at school, I realized just how far. I was at my locker when a girl I barely knew, Tasha, stared at me a little too long. "Hey," she said slowly. "This is gonna sound crazy, but you kinda sound like that girl from behind closed doors." My stomach dropped. "What?" I laughed, way too fast. "I don't even watch that stuff." But she didn't look convinced. I rushed to class and pretended it didn't bother me, but all day, I caught people whispering, glancing, frowning like they were trying to match the voice in their heads with the face in front of them. That afternoon, it got worse. Someone had posted a theory on TikTok that the girl behind the viral channel had to be from our town. The user pointed out landmarks I'd accidentally described, our grocery store, our church, even the layout of the neighborhood. People were putting pieces together. And my latest story? It was the final clue. That night, my world cracked open. My dad came home, red-faced and angry, gripping his phone in one hand and slamming the front door with the other. "Hazel," he bellowed. "Get down here. Now." I froze at the top of the stairs. My mom was already in the living room, her hands shaking, eyes wide like she'd seen a ghost. He stormed toward me and shoved the phone in my face. The screen showed a paused YouTube video. My video. His voice was shaking with rage. "Is this you?" I tried to lie. I really did. But my throat locked up. My body gave me away before I could even speak. My mom let out a strangled gasp. "Hazel," she whispered, "please tell me you didn't." My dad exploded. He yelled like I had murdered someone. Accused me of destroying the family's reputation. Of airing dirty laundry for attention. Of making things up to get internet fame. I told him it wasn't lies. That I had told the truth they'd forced me to bury for years. My mom broke down crying, not because of what I'd said, but because of what people were saying about her. That she was weak. That she stayed with a man who hurt her. That she allowed it all to happen. She kept saying, "They don't know me. They don't know us." But I did. I knew them better than anyone. And the world was starting to see what I'd seen all my life. The next morning, everything had changed. My parents didn't speak to me. They walked around the house like I was invisible again, but this time, it was different. There was hate in their silence. Shame. At school, the whispers turned into stares, then into rumors, and then into something else entirely. Respect. Girls I barely knew came up to me and said, "That video? That was my life too." One even hugged me and whispered, "You saved me." I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a grenade that had finally gone off. At home, my parents' relationship crumbled in real time. My dad refused to go to work. He said patients were canceling appointments. My mom's piano students dropped out one by one. Even our pastor stopped inviting them to events. We were no longer the picture-perfect family. We were the scandal of the town. And I was the girl who'd exposed it all. But instead of feeling proud, I felt numb. I sat in my room and watched the views climb. The comments grew by the second, but none of them made me feel better. Because the people I really wanted to hear from weren't strangers online. They were just two people down the hall. Two people who still couldn't look me in the eye. After the video went viral and the truth was out, there was no going back. My house, once full of arguments and fake smiles, became a hollow, echoing chamber of silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence. The kind that creeps under your skin. The kind that feels louder than words ever could. For the first time, my parents didn't yell. They didn't argue. They didn't even whisper. They moved through the house like ghosts. Cold. Avoidant. Distant. Mom stopped playing piano. The living room that used to echo with music now sat still with closed blinds and untouched keys. Dad spent most of his days in the garage, alone, pretending to fix things that weren't broken. And me? I kept uploading. Not every day. Not even every week. But when I did, It came from someplace raw. Honest. I stopped trying to hide the fact that it was me behind the voice. I never showed my face, but I let my words speak louder than any photo could. I shared how strange it felt to live in a house where everyone had been exposed but nobody apologized. How I hoped that one day someone would say, "I'm sorry you had to grow up like that." Not for views, not for pity, but just so I could hear it out loud for once in my life. I didn't think it would happen. And then, unexpectedly, it did. It was a Thursday afternoon when my mom knocked on my bedroom door. She never knocked before. Ever. I froze, not sure whether to answer. "Hazel," she said quietly. "Can we talk?" I opened the door halfway. She was holding something, a faded photo album I didn't recognize. She looked tired. Not from lack of sleep, but from something deeper. Regret, maybe. Guilt. Or both. She sat down on the edge of my bed like she was afraid it would break beneath her. "I listened to your videos," she said after a long silence. "All of them." I didn't know what to say. My throat clenched, and my fingers curled into my sleeves. "I kept thinking I was doing the right thing by staying," she whispered. "For you. For the family. For appearances. But I see now. I was just scared." She opened the photo album and pointed to a picture of me at age 5, sitting on her lap, holding a juice box with a shy smile. "You were always so quiet. So observant. I thought you didn't notice the fights. The tension. But now I know. You noticed everything." Tears welled in her eyes. "I failed you, Hazel, and I'm sorry. I should have protected you. I should have left when I had the chance." My eyes burned. My hands trembled. I had waited my whole life to hear something like that. But now that I had, it hurt more than I expected. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," I said. "I just needed someone to see me. To see what we were living through." "I see you now," she said. "And I'm proud of you." That shattered me. I cried in her arms for the first time since I was a kid. We sat on the floor together, like two people who had been drowning in the same water and just now realized we could float if we held on to each other. But my dad, he wasn't ready for that. He barely spoke to either of us for days. When I passed him in the hallway, he would avert his eyes like I wasn't his daughter anymore. One night, I found him in the kitchen drinking straight from a bottle of whiskey, staring out the window at nothing. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he slurred when he saw me. "Turning the whole town against us? You think you're better than us because people online think you're brave?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. "I gave you a roof, clothes, food. And this is how you repay me?" I took a breath and looked him in the eye. For the first time, I didn't flinch. "You gave me a house," I said, "but not a home." He scoffed, but the words seemed to hit him harder than he expected. He didn't yell after that. He just walked out and slammed the door behind him. I didn't see him for 3 days. When he came back, he looked different, sober, ashamed, tired. He didn't say much. Just handed me a letter he had written by hand and left it on my desk. I didn't open it for hours. I was afraid it would be cruel, dismissive, defensive. But it wasn't. It was real. In it, he wrote about his childhood, how he had grown up with a father even more brutal than he'd ever been. How he thought being strong meant being hard. How he never learned how to express love without control. And how he knew, deep down, that he had failed as a father. He ended it with, "You may not forgive me, and I don't expect you to, but please know, I am trying, in my own broken way." I cried again. Not for him, but for all the little versions of myself who had needed that letter for so long. I shared it with my followers, not the letter itself, but the story behind it. How healing isn't perfect. How sometimes the people who hurt you try to change, and sometimes they don't. But the real power is in being seen, in speaking, in refusing to stay quiet. That video became the most shared one I'd ever made. And suddenly, my channel was no longer about exposing pain. It was about showing what comes after the truth is spoken. The messy, complicated, human healing that comes when the silence is finally broken. After the dust began to settle inside our home, the rest of the world still wasn't finished talking. I thought maybe, just maybe, my story would slowly fade from the spotlight, that the town would move on to something else. But that's not how it worked. The kids at school kept watching every video I posted like it was the next episode of a binge-worthy drama. Teachers pulled me aside and asked if I needed counseling. Some even thanked me for being brave, which felt weird coming from adults who used to ignore the bruises on my voice. The whispers had stopped, but the eyes hadn't. I was no longer invisible, but being visible came with a price. People now thought they knew me, that I was strong, that I was an advocate, that I had everything figured out because I could put pain into poetic words. But the truth? I was still just a girl trying to survive in a house that still had cracks in the walls. Only now, those cracks were visible to the entire town. I had strangers DMing me, telling me their life stories, asking for advice, begging for hope. I tried to respond to as many as I could, but I felt overwhelmed, like the weight of other people's healing was now on my shoulders. And that wasn't even the hardest part. The hardest part came one day when I walked into the grocery store with my mom to buy milk and cereal. A woman with perfectly styled hair and a baby on her hips stood in front of the frozen food aisle, eyes wide as she looked at us. "You're the mom from those YouTube videos," she said, her voice filled with both judgment and curiosity. My mom froze. The woman smiled, but it wasn't warm. I just wanted to say, it takes a lot to raise a child in a situation like that. And to survive all that judgment. Good for you for not hiding under a rock. It sounded like a compliment. But it wasn't. It was a warning. People had opinions now. People who knew nothing about our lives outside a 10-minute voiceover were building stories of their own. After that, my mom stopped going out. She canceled her remaining piano lessons. She deleted Facebook. For a while, I worried that I destroyed her life. That maybe I'd made things worse for her instead of better. But one night, I walked past her bedroom door and heard her humming. She was sitting at her piano again, sheet music open, fingers gently pressing the keys like they were old friends. She was healing, in her own time. And me? I was learning something even more difficult. That telling the truth doesn't end the story. It just starts a new one. The real change began with small things. My dad started therapy. Real therapy, not the kind you pretend to go to for appearances. He admitted to things he'd never said out loud before, to a therapist, and eventually, to me. He asked if we could start over. I told him no. But I told him we could start again. Not from scratch, but from where we were. Broken. A little better. Still unsure. That was enough. He stopped drinking. He started coming home early. And while it was too late for dad and daughter movie nights or helping with homework, he did start knocking before entering my room. He started asking me how I was, not in passing, but like he actually cared about the answer. I still didn't forgive him completely. But forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't one big moment. It was a series of tiny decisions to open the door, just an inch, again and again. As for my channel, it changed too. I made a video one afternoon titled, "The Quiet Teen Speaks, and Now She Listens Too." In it, I talked about how pain is real, but it doesn't have to be permanent. I shared what healing looked like behind the scenes, not dramatic or perfect, but awkward, messy, full of setbacks and progress. The video went viral. But this time, not because people were shocked or scandalized. This time, they were inspired. People began sharing their own stories. Thousands of them. I started a series called Echoes, where I read viewer-submitted stories anonymously, just like I had once told my own. My followers doubled in a month. But more importantly, I stopped feeling alone. One day, I got an email from a girl named Kendra who said, "Your voice kept me alive when I didn't think anyone cared. You gave words to a life I couldn't describe." That's when I realized I hadn't destroyed my family. I had simply refused to protect the version of us that was never real to begin with. And now, something better was growing in its place. A family that told the truth. A girl who knew her voice mattered. A future that wasn't perfect, but finally felt possible. It's strange how something that once felt like a secret became the very thing that saved me. When I started behind closed doors, I never thought it would change anyone's life, not even my own. I just needed to say things out loud, to speak into the void and hope someone, somewhere, would echo back. But what I didn't expect was how much that echo would transform everything. Months had passed since the video that changed my family, and in so many ways, we were still adjusting. Healing wasn't linear. My mom had good days and bad ones. My dad still struggled to sit with silence without pouring something into a glass. And I still had nights where I doubted myself, where I wondered if I had made a mistake by ever uploading that first story. But then something happened that reminded me why I did it. It was the middle of a chilly November afternoon when my school's counselor, Ms. Rivera, asked if I could speak at a mental health assembly. I froze. Me, the girl who never even raised her hand in class? I don't want you to do a speech, she said gently. I just want you to be you. To tell your story. However you're comfortable. Part of me wanted to say no. To hide behind the screen like I always had. But I realized something. The girl who used to whisper her truth into a microphone was now strong enough to speak it in a room full of people. So, I said yes. The day of the assembly, my palms were sweaty. I stood on the stage in the school auditorium in front of hundreds of faces, some curious, some skeptical, some surprisingly supportive. I didn't read from a script. I didn't need to. I just spoke. I talked about growing up in a house where love felt like obligation, where silence was safer than truth. I talked about watching my parents fake their smiles and learning to do the same. And then, I told them what it felt like to finally use my voice. To risk everything. And still come out whole. The auditorium was dead quiet when I finished. Then, slowly, applause. Then cheers. Not for drama. Not for gossip. But for truth. That day, I felt seen. Not just online, not just by strangers, but by the very people I used to walk past in the hallways, wondering if they ever noticed I existed. Afterward, a few students came up to me. One of them, a football player who'd never spoken to me before, said, "My parents yell all the time too. But I never thought I could talk about it." Another girl pulled me into a hug and said, "Thank you for saying what I've always been too scared to." That night, I got home to find my mom waiting with 2 mugs of cocoa. She smiled as she handed me one. I watched the video, the assembly one. Someone posted it online. I blinked. Really? She nodded. You looked strong. Not just brave, strong. You didn't just find your voice, Hazel. You taught people how to find theirs too. I looked down at my cocoa, tears welling behind my eyes. Do you regret it? I asked. Everything I posted? She didn't answer right away. Then she said, I regret what made it necessary. But not the fact that you told the truth. You saved more than just yourself. Later that night, I walked into the garage and found my dad sitting at the old workbench. He was writing something in a journal. When he saw me, he gave a small nod. Hey kid, he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. We didn't talk long. Just a few words exchanged. But before I left, he looked up and said, You were right about everything. And I want to be better. I want to earn a second chance even if it takes the rest of my life. I nodded. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It wasn't instant forgiveness. But it was real. And that mattered more. The channel kept growing, but my relationship with it changed. I stopped hiding behind it and started stepping into the light. I began doing interviews, panels, even collaborating with mental health nonprofits. Not for fame. Not for money. But because I finally understood the weight and power of being heard. I created a series called Quiet No More, where teens could send in voice recordings anonymously and share the things they'd never told anyone. I partnered with professionals to respond, offer support, and create a space that wasn't just about survival, but about recovery. And then, one day, I got an email from YouTube. Behind Closed Doors had been nominated for a Community Impact Award. I laughed and cried at the same time. Me? The quiet girl? The invisible one? Now I was being seen by the world. But more importantly, I saw myself. A few days after the nomination, I sat on my bed, phone in hand, reading a comment from a 14-year-old girl that said, Because of you, I finally asked for help. I thought I was alone. but I'm not anymore. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, tears running down my cheeks. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a story about exposing a broken marriage or surviving toxic parents. It was a story about reclaiming the narrative, about speaking when the world tells you to stay silent, about turning pain into purpose. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I felt powerful. Because I wasn't just a girl who watched too much YouTube. I was the girl who turned her silence into a movement. And I would never be quiet again. It's been over a year since I uploaded that first story in my closet. Since then, my world has changed in ways I couldn't have imagined, not just in numbers or followers, but in meaning. I'm no longer that invisible girl sitting alone in the back of the classroom. I'm no longer the silent observer in a broken house, waiting for the yelling to stop. I'm Hazel Riley, creator of Behind Closed Doors, speaker, advocate, and someone who finally believes she's allowed to exist out loud. After graduation, I got invited to speak at a national teen mental health conference in Chicago. They flew me out, paid for my hotel, and gave me a full hour on stage. Me, a girl who used to whisper stories into a phone under her blanket. I'll never forget walking up to that microphone and seeing hundreds of teenagers, some sitting forward in their chairs, some quietly crying, some holding signs that said, "We hear you, Hazel." I talked about what happens after you speak the truth. How healing isn't always neat. How some nights still feel heavy. How sometimes you miss the people you had to walk away from. But I also talked about growth, the kind that's slow, quiet, and real. I told them, you don't need a perfect ending. You just need one moment where you decide that you get to write the next chapter. When I stepped off that stage, I was different. Not because of the applause, but because I knew I'd finally stepped fully into the life I'd always been told to keep small. Back at home, things weren't perfect. They never would be. But something had shifted. My mom started volunteering at a women's shelter. She didn't tell many people why, just said she understood. But I knew it was her way of giving back, of honoring her own journey through shame and survival. My dad started working with a counselor who specializes in men's behavioral recovery. Some days he came home frustrated, quiet, withdrawn. But he stayed sober. He started journaling more. Once, I caught him watching one of my early videos. He didn't say a word, but he looked at me with eyes that held something new: accountability. And then, something wild happened. Colleges started reaching out. Not just because of my grades, but because of my work. One professor at NYU told me, "We're studying the sociological impact of platforms like yours. You've created something we normally only see in large-scale nonprofit campaigns." Eventually, I accepted a full scholarship to a university in Oregon, majoring in digital communications and trauma psychology. The idea that I could study the very thing I lived through, that I could one day help others through it from both a personal and professional lens, it felt like I had broken a cycle and stepped into a whole new lineage. Before I left for college, my mom gave me something I didn't expect. It was a small voice recorder, the same kind she used to use when she was young, back when she had dreams of being a radio DJ, before life crushed those dreams under the weight of survival. "I lost my voice once too," she said, tears in her eyes. "But you found yours, and helped me find mine again. So here. Now it's yours.